Welcome to Life Unrestricted.
This is your show if you're sick of living a life controlled by food and exercise rules, and if you're ready to learn how to accept yourself and enjoy the heck out of life. My gig is about body image, femininity, self-worth, and resilience. Come on, let's walk side by side as we slowly step out of restriction misery and unlock our true selves.
Your host, Merritt Boxler, is a former national radio DJ, freelance journalist, speaker, and writer with a passion to make women feel good in their bodies. This is a show brought to you live from Switzerland.
Hey, sweet radicals. Here we go again. I'm so happy to have you back. And I'm immensely grateful to be able to announce that I have 2 new Patreons for this show. As you know, there are no strings attached for people who decide to support this mission here. So there are always fluctuations, of course. And I've recently had some people who had to cancel their pledge due to their personal situations. And I've started worrying a little bit. You know, whether or not this was still bringing you the content you like, or whether it was not what people like after all. I guess it was just the old gremlin again, but I was doubting myself a little bit. So when I saw that I have 2 new Patreons, I felt all the feels. Heather and Trupti, you marvelous human beings. You deserve my deep gratitude. Your pledges make me see that this work is appreciated, and it isn't just that I'm very grateful that you consider my work worthy of your support. It's also that I'm happy to see that this means that I can go on producing this for the time being at least. And so I think your contribution on Patreon is really making a lot of other people happy too. Those people who reach out to me saying that this podcast is helping them keeping sane in this diet messages infested world. You know, I really think that's what's really important on this journey, to relearn to trust our bodies. It's community, which means mutual support. So my heart is full of marshmallowy feelings for your willingness to support this podcast endeavor that I want to help changing the world with. Thank you so much, Heather and Trupti. And if you, dear radical, want to join the ranks, please do. You can check out my page on patreon.com/lifeunrestricted, and I will for sure give you the hugest shout out for your help. Either way, lovely radical, you're the best. It's great to have such awesome listeners. Thank you for being here. And before we start with today's conversation with Chevese Turner, the woman who founded BEDA, the Binge Eating Disorder Association, I want to explore some ideas a little further. And I started it last time in the episode with Jessica Setnick when I talked about how much hate and judgment there is on the internet these days, how viciously people attack each other in the comment sections of posts and articles, and how instead of a healthy discourse or any sort of resemblance of a respectful debate, there often are nothing but hair-trigger escalations, everyone assuming the worst of intentions coming from the other side, and often a complete inability or unwillingness even to hear the other person out. And I find this lack of generosity to be a disturbing development, and it represents how much fear there is in this world at this moment in time. And I think we should work on reducing that and start seeing each other again. And I'm not saying this from a place of holier than thou or anything, because surprise, I'm a human being too. And I'm packed full with anxieties most days. So I understand the impulse to want to react instead of respond. I mean, we all have a hard time sitting with the discomfort of having someone express something that does not chime with our belief system. It's cognitive dissonance. So we get defensive. That's normal. Personally, for example, I have come to realize that when in my mind a perceived threat, or when I'm tired or hungry, my tendency to shut down and avoid and also to want to attack increases. So I know how to better approach or respond to situations where people's views differ from mine. Depending on the situation, I can listen or I can let it go. I know that sometimes it is better to let shit go and set boundaries depending on how I feel or how much capacity I have to have a debate even. But when I feel well and well rested and well fed, I find myself pretty open to expanding my mind, and I certainly don't automatically lash out. But I've come to see that when I do want to lash out, I usually do it to avoid having to deal with a difficult situation at hand or a potentially difficult emotion inside of myself. And let's be real here, the tendency to avoid those feelings is human, nothing to be ashamed of. Again, just something to become aware of so that it doesn't always have to get the better of us and steer our actions. We can only start changing something when we admit it to ourselves and accept that we are human too, that we make mistakes and that that's okay. It's also okay to have difficult emotions. That's human too. Despite of all the shiny happiness rhetoric out there, it is deeply human to have difficult emotions. They usually show us something or point us in a direction. But when we just succumb to our tendency to always avoid or suppress them, or even deny having them, we are not really doing ourselves or the world a favor, because the problem is everything that we deny, run from, or suppress, that's going to fester in us. And that shit pops up in all kinds of unexpected circumstances somewhere down the line. We might fly into rages, we might isolate, we start people-pleasing, we're not in touch with our truth anymore, we get depressed, we lose joy, we become hypercritical of ourselves, we judge and blame everyone else, and silently, of course, also ourselves, all for the sake of finding that elusive happiness that is being marketed to us everywhere. We try to become a happy person by turning into a perfectionistic, obsessed worrywart. We try becoming a happy person by pretending to be someone we're not. We try becoming a happy person by buying more things. We try becoming a happy person by making our happiness dependent on other people, a partner, a lifestyle plan, or a number on the scale. And we are pretty damn stubborn in our pursuit, aren't we? But sooner or later, and for you I hope it's rather sooner than later, we find ourselves exhausted, devoid of a sense of meaning and feeling empty. And usually only then are we willing to go, wait a minute. Now that I've worked my butt off to fit into a smaller pair of jeans, why don't I feel better about myself? Wait a minute, now that I have X amounts of followers on social media, why do I still feel anxious and empty inside? Wait a minute, now that I've got this new gadget, why does it already feel old? Wait a minute, why is this carrot that I'm chasing never actually any closer to my mouth? What the heck? And sometimes it takes this point of complete exhaustion, of surrender, of finally admitting to ourselves that we might have been believing the wrong thing. Because it takes a while for us to be ready to admit that we were wrong. After all, we've been investing in that, so we don't like to be wrong. Did you know they conducted social studies where they could repeatedly prove that even in light of evidence to the contrary, people were holding on to their old beliefs? Maybe you noticed this phenomenon too, that there are some people that you talk to that no matter what you say, no matter how eloquently you can elaborate your point, no matter how much evidence you present, they will only become more defensive of their own position. Yeah, apparently that's a human thing, which makes fighting diet culture even harder, of course, because no matter what we say, if someone is deeply invested and if someone's not ready to hear it, they will try and shut us down. Just as flat earth believers will shut down any evidence of the earth actually being round. So it's important not to take it personally when you try to, quote, help someone with your point. Better be mindful of your own energies and set healthy boundaries, and maybe plant a seed and step back. I think it can only fall on fertile ground when someone already has a crack in their shell where the light can get in and where that seed is actually welcome. I just have to think back, how many times in my life did I not want to give up on the belief that my body is wrong and should look different? How many times did I try another diet? How many times do I still want to go back? Just because there's this voice in my head telling me that maybe I should be trying because everybody says so, right? So I'm mindful of that. I guess I better stop ranting now because we have a great episode coming up. And hopefully there are many intros to come in which I can share my mental clutter with you. So anyway, this week on the Life Unrestricted podcast, it's my pleasure to talk to Chevese Turner from the Washington, D.C. area. Chevese is the woman who almost 9 years ago founded the Binge Eating Disorder Association, BEDA, in June 2008 it was, recognizing the need for an organization to advocate on behalf of individuals affected by binge eating disorder, BED, as well as the providers who treat them. Turner's well-rounded career in the healthcare, pharmaceutical, political, and nonprofit arenas, as well as her many leadership roles within these fields, prepared her to launch BEDA, the only organization specifically suited to support individuals and, as I said, treatment professionals managing BED. The first thing I asked Chevese was if she had a specific childhood memory that marked the end of her feeling carefree and unself-conscious in her own body.
Yes, very much so. I recall at around age 5, probably the earliest that I can remember myself really feeling myself in a body. And I think what is so interesting about that time was it was the time also that my parents became very, very focused on my body. So I recall one day running around outside with, little friends in our yard and my brother, and being called inside for lunch. And a little girl in the backyard had made some comment about my body being, I don't know that she used the word fat, but she definitely insinuated fat. And I just remember my entire body all of a sudden feeling so much heavier. Just, running inside was much more laborious than it had been in the 10 seconds previous to the comment. I went inside and my mother said, "We're having tomato sandwiches for lunch." And I'm standing in the kitchen and I just remember, if there was one thing on the face of this earth that I did not want to eat, it was a tomato. And the thought of a tomato sandwich was absolutely bizarre to me, because we usually had, some sort of meat in a sandwich, or my mother would make something else. But on this particular day, she had decided that she was worried about my weight and that we were going to have some sort of vegetable sandwich because that would be much healthier for me. And so these two things compounded. It was as if the whole world had just stopped and suddenly focused on my body, which made my experience of my body just so acute in terms of how I felt in it. It was suddenly so much heavier and so much bigger than how I felt in my body prior to this happening. And, all of this happened within 5 minutes. And so it was an amazingly long 5 minutes and really changed how I felt within myself.
And you never forgot the moment. That's the interesting thing. It's like the weight of shame, when that starts to come in and pile on top of us, like our innocence is completely stolen from us from that moment on. We're being made self-conscious. And from then on, until we work on ourselves, this will be weighing us down and putting us in all sorts of different directions of maybe eating disorders or other ways of hating on ourselves.
Exactly.
So how did that influence your eating or how you relate it to your body?
Yeah. It just, I know that it started prior to that incident. It's just that is the one that sticks in my mind. And so it really just served as a catalyst to a lot of the beginning pieces of disordered eating. And so I remember not too long after that being in our kitchen and looking for something to eat, because from all of everything I can remember and all of the evidence I have, I wasn't given a lot of food to eat, so I was hungry. I was a little girl using a lot of energy, and I was hungry. And so I was rummaging around in a drawer, and I found some ice cream cones, just the plain sort of cake cones. And
without ice cream in them.
Right. And I took those up to my room, and I hid them under my bed, and I just, the next chance that I had, I went up there. And I don't even know how many of them I ate, but I'm sure it was quite a few. And it just, having that satisfied feeling of actually feeling full was so wonderful to me at the time. And I can't remember every step that was a part of getting to actually binge eating, but that was definitely one of them.
I also relate to that so much because I grew up in a very dangerous and violent household and pretty unstable. And I was put on diets when I was really small. So I totally relate to, being shamed. And my mother really ridiculed me and my body. And she put me on a scale every morning, when I was 4 and 5. And she made me take note of the number, and she put sort of like an Excel sheet on our kitchen door, and I had to mark my weight. And when it was going down, I was being spared some sort of punishment, and if it was going up, then there was simply not anything to eat. And I remember that it's sad, but I own the story now, so I can laugh about it, but it's tragic. I remember that I ate cat kibble.
Oh, wow.
And I made it to be okay tasting. Like, I wasn't too weirded out. I was just hungry. And I stole stuff from how do you call those? Kiosk?
Yeah.
The candy stores or whatever. And that got me into a whole lot of trouble. That made me focus on food so much more because I was hungry. And then I started to attach to food as in, this is my only friend. And I have to make sure there's enough of this. How can I make sure there's enough of this? And I did make sure there's enough of this by going to my schoolmates' houses and rummaging around their kitchen and asking their moms for food and begging for food and stealing food and eating cat kibble and stuff like that. And my mom was trying to watch my weight and making fun of me. So that's why I'm so passionate, because I think it really starts early, and there is so much influence. If we're raised in households that are full of dieting people and diet talk and a hyper focus on appearance and weight, or even teasing, then of course we're going to somehow attach to food in an unhealthy way. Some don't eat, and some overeat, and some eat in hiding,
Yeah.
Maybe you are relating to hoarding as well. For a while, I hoarded food and hid it because I was never sure when I would get it.
Absolutely. I did the same thing, and I would I mean, I would steal money to buy food. I would steal food. I relate so much to what you're saying because I would go to friend's house and, my grandparents' house, and wherever I was, I would try to find food that I could steal and take home with me. Mm-hmm. Or I would, when my mother was at the grocery store, when we went with my mom, I would steal some money from her purse and run around the grocery store and buy some things and sneak them outside to the car. This was when I was a little bit older, but, while my mom wasn't looking, because I knew she wasn't going to buy the things that I really wanted to eat, or she wouldn't buy enough, or it just was a matter of having enough so when I was hungry, I could eat. And I had a floorboard in my room. We lived in an old house, and there was a loose floorboard, and there was sort of a little almost box area under the floorboard, and I would stash food in that floorboard because I was sure that my mom couldn't find that. Because if she did find the food, there was hell to pay. There was more dieting and lots of shame, and I can relate so much to what you're saying. It's not that my parents physically abused me, but there was a lot of shaming and a lot of diet talk and a lot of undermining the person that I was in an effort to keep, me in a body that was okay, according to them. And my mom had experienced the same thing growing up in her family and more. It was an environment that included a lot of domestic violence, and you can see the intergenerational trauma.
Completely, yes.
Yeah, and it just, of course you're going to, what else is a 5-year-old or a 3-year-old or, going to choose but food? I mean, of course that's going to be the attachment, especially when the human attachments are weak and food is the only thing accessible to a child and there's not enough of it.
Yeah.
So, it makes complete sense.
And you're so right about, what we get passed on and what our parents got passed on. If we don't get self-aware and work on that stuff and make this tragic hockey puck stop at our feet, then we are bound to pass it on anyway, because no one can help it. We just do. You know how there's so many people saying, I never want to end up like my parents. And then one day they go, how did I end up like my parents? And that's just what happens when we don't wake up and own our shit and look into what happened. And that's a painful thing. It is for me. And I so relate to, it's like a sister story. And I also related to food a lot as if it were love, because I was also love deprived and there was no safety at home. And I had grandparents that were really nice to me, but they couldn't really do anything because back in the 70s and 80s, there was no way you could take a kid from a mother that pretended that everything was okay. And they knew that something was hellishly wrong, but they couldn't actually do anything. So what they did was they made sure that I could go and visit them on holidays, and that when I was there, they could take care of me. And my mom realized this very quickly. So a number one punishment was, you're not going to your grandparents this summer. And that was the capital punishment for me. I would literally shrink and want to leave the earth because that was the only place where I experienced safety. And what my grandparents would do is they would overfeed me. They would serve me food all the time. They would like eat. Are you hungry? And I would always say yes. And I ate. And I loved it. And they would give me, candy bars and our wonderful Swiss chocolate, whole chunks of chocolate to keep and take this back home. And look, there's some cookies to take with you, they were feeling guilty that they had to let me get back into this hell that I was living in. So they kind of assuaged things with giving me food, and I kind of really held on to that, and I hid that all over my little room that I had in my undie drawer, and everywhere I could. I hid some food that my grandparents gave me, you know.
Sure. Yeah, it makes total sense to
Yeah.
me. And it really is, you know, when you think about it, what we do with food as a result of all of these kind of things is actually so wise.
Yeah, and it's a sort of survival. It's true. As I'm making peace with all that, I had to realize that I really was doing the best I knew how to do. You know, for 20 years, I was like, what the hell is wrong with me? Why can I not relate to food like everyone else? This shouldn't be so hard. Why am I fucking everything up? Blah, blah, blah. And I didn't realize that at the time this was a very sensible thing to do, because the world was not safe. I was overwhelmed all the time. The only thing that I could hold on to was food. So I did.
Right.
It's not the dumbest thing, you know.
No, absolutely not. It's smart. It's what you needed to do.
But as I learned from your story, your mother related to food in quite the opposite way.
She has said that as a teenager, she probably had anorexia. You know, in those days, you just weren't diagnosed. And she never was severely ill enough to be, well, she probably was actually, but no one knew that she needed to be hospitalized. And then
no one said anything?
No. I mean, she wasn't underweight enough to, you know, she was praised because as a child and into her early teens, she was always considered chunky. That was the word. So,
and then she became a diet success, and she wasn't skinny enough for people to or doctors to realize that it was highly disordered. That's my story, losing weight and then becoming so obsessed with it. But on the outside, it was nothing but a success. How do you do it? Why? How can you have such discipline? Blah, blah, blah.
Right. And she was a teenager in the 60s when being ultra thin and showing your ribs was a good thing. And then she became pregnant with me, and she and my father married after that. And then in her 20s, she continued to restrict, and she started using alcohol, and her alcoholism escalated quickly, and that became the focus. There was no focus at all on food and what she was doing with her relationship with food. It was all on alcohol.
That's what caught all the attention.
Right. And in the meantime, you know, I'm this little girl who already has been on many diets, whether they were, you know, my mother put me on a diet, or whether it was a doctor who gave me diet pills at age 10, or whatever it was. I was already very fluent in dieting. And
so tragic, but
yeah. And then into my teenage years, I started using alcohol as well.
In your teen years already?
Yeah.
Do you remember what got that started?
I mean, I remember the first time I ever drank, it was this horrible stuff called slow gin. And it,
sounds
you know,
horrible.
It's like this syrupy cherry stuff that you mixed with seltzer or whatever you mixed it with. But, you know, it was palatable at the time. and from there, it was just, I found a group of friends that we all were engaged in eating disorder behavior, but we didn't see that. Some of my friends were purging. I wasn't. I tried, and we were all drinking, binge drinking, basically. And we thought it was the best of times. It was, I mean, I look back now and I think, oh my God, you know, because I have a son who is almost 14, and I think just to think about what I was doing at age 14.
Yeah, it pains you.
Yeah, and the dieting, the eating or drinking instead of eating, and everything that goes along with that. So, and I hated myself at the same time. I still was not a thin person. And so no matter what I did, I couldn't be in the body that I wanted to be in. The binging and the purging and the drinking, and none of it was leading to quote unquote success for me. And so it just was this deeper and deeper hole of disordered eating disorder, and having no awareness that it was anything but lack of self-control.
Yeah, and that it was also a sign of self-harm.
Right.
But no one realizes this, because it's uncanny to listen to you, because I had so many of the similar experiences when I was in puberty, and after that, when I started to lose weight, all of the girlfriends I was with, they were all disordered eaters. Some of them were not eating, some of them were vomiting, some of them were drinking instead of eating. I was back then, I guess, already exercising too much, because my mom's drinking was so bad, and it eventually killed her also. Probably not really nourishing herself.
Right.
And drinking and pills. So she died. But that was kind of horrifying enough for me to realize I'm not going down that route, you know. So I always had my eyes very fixated on not drinking and no drugs. And I have to be self-reliant to make it in this world, so do not. And of course I had my drinking stints and stuff, but I couldn't do the binge drinking stuff, and I always ended up being the one that drove everybody home and, you know, cleaned up all the messes and blah. But yeah, I just couldn't do it. So for me, it really was food. And I remember we looked at magazines, beauty magazines, and telling each other who we want to look like most, and admiring women who were more beautiful than us, even though, you know, those that I have kept in touch, many have suffered tremendously from either substance abuse and the consequences of that, or developing full-blown eating disorders and suffering the consequences of that, or falling into the trap of believing that appearance is everything, and then scoring high on a fuckability scale, meter, whatever, but not really ever finding love and ending up in horrible marriages, being completely unhappy, and seeing that we're all barking up the wrong tree.
Correct, exactly.
So no one ever teaches us really our lovability, and how to handle emotions. As soon as we're born, we have conditions piling on top of us, saying that we need to earn our love. And for most women, that is appearance related. And for guys, it's being the strong one and the powerful one and the rich one. It's so sick how we're being conditioned into boxes, and we lose touch to our innate inner happiness, or that only we ourselves have the key to happiness and our lovability. And we lose that, and we chase some dragon outside, and we never catch it.
Right, exactly.
How did that drinking develop for you?
Well, like you, drinking never was the thing for me. I did binge drink, and I did a lot of drinking from my mid-teens to my mid-20s. But thankfully, at the beginning, I'd say I was 22 when I first began doing therapy. And
me too. I can't believe it. It's so uncanny. Yeah.
And drinking was something for me that it just gradually faded away. It was something that I did with friends, and yes, there were times I binge drank, but I too was the person that, even though I was drinking, I was the person taking care of everyone else.
Just as with our mothers, right?
Right, exactly.
Taking care of everything.
Right. So I would be the one that insisted on driving all the time, because I thought that I could drive drunk the safest.
Yeah, me too. And I think to this day, I believe I did. I'm an
Yeah.
awesome driver.
Me too.
Yeah.
I never had an accident, and I love to drive.
Me too.
But, and my best friend during those years had bulimia. And I mean, we were just glued at the hip for many years. And after I started doing therapy, and I didn't get proper eating disorder help for many, many years after that.
Yes,
But just
me either.
entering into that relationship with a therapist, and it was baby steps. It was most of my early therapeutic relationships were still focused on weight loss. I was seeing therapists who their goal and my goal was to address the psychological reasons that I was overeating and helping me lose weight.
So food was an issue in therapy, because that's where our stories differ, probably, because I went to therapy as well. But interestingly enough, if you're not looking sick, and I never looked sick, as I said, I probably went down your mom's route and just I performed a diet success. So no one ever asked about my eating. And I think this should be part of every therapy, that a therapist asks about our behaviors with food, our beliefs around food. But it's a steep order, given that many therapists, just as many nutritionists and many trainers, are disordered themselves. So that will be highly biased. But I think no one ever asked me about my eating. That was given that I was some sort of success. So I guess that must be different for someone struggling with binge eating disorder without any way of purging, be that exercising or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Then it gets addressed, because it's kind of the elephant in the room, but they focus on that solely. Did you experience that?
So it's a complicated question, and there's pieces. The interesting thing about the early years and it being focused on as overeating and, the pursuit of weight loss is that was actually just entrenching the eating disorder, because a big part of binge eating disorder is restriction. And so
that was perpetuating the cycle, getting the order to restrict, which sets you up for a binge.
Right. And over-exercise as well. It's just that I was over-exercising in a fat body. And I would have periods of losing weight, but I could only do it for so long, and then everything would fall apart, or I would leave a therapist for one reason or another and not have the weekly weigh-ins and all of that sort of thing. And the binging would resume, but it just would all fall apart. And I did that so many times, whether it was with an individual therapist or it was at an eating disorder and weight management clinic. The pursuit of weight loss because of what my body looked like was always the number one answer to whatever the diagnosis was. And I mean, the diagnosis was always just she eats too much.
That's terrible. That must lead to so much shame.
Oh, incredible. But at the time, I thought it was, there was no other answer. It was me who was so damaged that I had to turn to food. And that, in my mind, was a willpower issue.
Why can I not stop this? Yeah.
Right. And not just, no one saying, you know what, you're perfect.
Yes, your body does the perfect thing. This urge is a perfect response to deprivation. No one tells you that, right?
Exactly.
Even though every research points to that, but we're not told the fact.
Right. Well, and what's so interesting is then even when I found eating disorder therapists who were trained in eating disorders and knew how eating disorders acted, what they look like, what to look for, they looked at my body and said, despite this woman having all of that symptomatology, I'm still going to recommend weight loss.
That's the weight of the bias.
Yeah.
It speaks volumes of all the prejudices out there. Just
Exactly.
as you said, like with exercise, I hear so many people say they should just move more and eat less.
Right.
And I often think, what do you think
before.
that person has been doing for the last 20 years? They've been on diets and trying new exercise routines, and everybody labels them as being slobs and all those prejudices.
I always say if there were an Olympics for weight loss, I could have definitely had a medal by now, because that was my job.
Exactly. You never lived your life. That's so many women and men get stuck in that never-ending cycle of I have to go on a diet. I blew my diet.
Yes.
I should go on a diet. I have eaten too much. You might have become a marine biologist, for Christ's sake.
Exactly.
But you were busy dieting, trying to conform to a standard that was put on you without you having a say in the matter.
Right. And in fact, I tell a story oftentimes when I speak about how when I finally decided to go back to college at age 25, I was filling out applications. And by this time, I was in a much better place. My eating disorder was definitely not under control, but I had started the process of getting to healing. And so I was applying to colleges, and in each of the applications, I would get to the point where the question would be, what are your hobbies and extracurriculars?
Dieting. Oh, no.
Yeah, I mean, there was nothing else. I liked to play tennis, but I quit in high school because the coach told me that I was too fat for tennis. And
how helpful.
And the same with field hockey. And, I quit everything because I was convinced I wasn't good enough for it. So the only thing I did in my spare time when I wasn't working or going to school was I dieted. I read about dieting, or I tried to figure out better ways of dieting, or I was exercising. And so I made up things on my college applications because I didn't have anything else.
I so get that, yes.
Yeah, it's so tragic.
Yeah, I made exercise my sole hobby because that was my only compulsion. It was my way of purging. And I was worried constantly, what should I eat? When should I eat it? When can I be alone to eat? Over the years, it gets worse and worse. I mean, it didn't start out that way, but it started to become all-consuming. And where were my hobbies? Like, I love to do improv. I love to drum. I love to be silly. I love to read. And I love to be lazy. But where the hell did that go? That's not appropriate. So I beat everything out of myself. You know what I mean?
Right. Mm-hmm. And it was this is really how Beta came about, because after the birth of my first son, which was almost 14 years ago, I went into congestive heart failure. And
is that something like a heart attack?
It's when the heart muscle becomes so weak that it can't pump properly.
Okay.
So it's also called cardiomyopathy. I mean, I was almost dead, and I survived it. And I see clearly now that my heart was weakened by so much weight cycling and all of the things that I did to my body with my eating disorder and probably alcohol as well. And at the time in a woman's life when you have some of the biggest metabolic changes that are possible, when you give birth, my heart just said, boop,
Mm-hmm.
I'm done. So fortunately, I survived.
And metaphorically,
yes.
Excuse me for interrupting, but
yes.
Metaphorically, your heart was weakened after 30 years of being shamed.
Right.
into
Exactly.
and not being allowed to be who you were, and that you were being made wrong all the time. Your eating was wrong, your body was wrong, everything was wrong. How can a heart be strong in that? It hurts so much that it literally
Right.
breaks your heart.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I'm fortunate because I lived to tell the tale.
Thank God, yeah.
Yeah, went on to have another child. Everyone survived and is healthy. And after that happened, I was freaked. I was like, oh my gosh, here I am with a little boy and I could die. So after the birth of my second son, I decided I was going to have lap band surgery. And it was such a reaction to what had happened, and now having two small children and being afraid of dying. And
You
so I
just wanted to be
this,
done with it?
right.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I had decent, I finally was working with a therapist who was treating the eating disorder and who saw this very differently than any other person I had worked with.
How?
For the first time, someone introduced me to non-dieting and named the eating disorder, said it's binge eating disorder, and that, dieting was never going to solve anything.
How did that compute for you?
Oh, at first it was, this woman is crazy.
Yes,
And
of course.
I don't like that word because of, all the implications, but that's how I thought in those days. And I worked with her for many years and was in a pretty good place, but I moved and I started working with another therapist, and I just felt like I still needed to lose weight. And so I had lap band surgery, and I came out. I did it, and I came out on the other side and said, what did I do? Because I knew that I had done the wrong thing for myself, that I knew that this was just going to feed into my eating disorder. Mm-hmm. And I knew that it wasn't going to solve anything for me.
Wow, that's very self-aware, though. I mean, I know quite a few women one who had some sort of bariatric surgery a year ago, or not even a year ago, and she's still in that honeymoon phase. But
yes,
I wonder how they would ever allow her, because she was once anorexic looking, and then she's very traumatized from earlier on, and then she kind of turned the whole thing around, and then she started binge eating, and now she had this operation. And even though she swore, I wanted to talk her out of it, but I had no chance. She just wanted to be skinny again. And then she swore to me that she only wanted to lose, a very small amount of pounds and stay healthy, but she had to somehow kickstart normal eating by having a smaller stomach, right? And now she has lost so much weight already, and she couldn't stop herself, probably. She said, why don't you never comment on my weight loss? Don't you think I look better? And I said, no. Sorry, I'm not. I'm only waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not going to collude with the eating disorder by telling her that.
No, and I knew I can't say anything, but I know she will one day be very disappointed. And she went through a tremendous pain, and she still has a lot of stuff going on. But to her right now, everything is about weight loss. And I knew that would happen. I mean, she was previously anorexic. What do you think?
Yeah. And the fact that there are so many professionals, even in the eating disorder world, who would probably agree with her that it was a good idea.
Yes, she told me that. She had an eating disorder therapist, obviously, or somebody told her that it would be okay. Why?
Because there is so much bias even within the eating disorders community. That's why it took me so long to get the proper help.
Haven't they found out that people regain the weight after maybe a little bit longer than if you were on a regular diet, but that it really doesn't help anything because the problem wasn't addressed really? I don't know much about that, but please tell everyone who's curious as well, just like I am.
What's interesting is the research is primarily done, of course, by the bariatric industry.
Of course.
And so the research is powered to show, you know, what the bariatric industry wants to show. Mm-hmm. And many of the eating disorder clinicians and physicians who were out there came through training programs that included obesity training. And they see it as the flip side of anorexia. They see binge eating disorder or higher weight eating disorders as the other side of the coin. And it's so not. I just think they don't have the length of experience. And I think that the biggest factor is that many people in the eating disorders field are recovered or not recovered from their own eating disorders and are still very fearful. They've internalized weight stigma. They help perpetrate weight stigma, and they are unable or unwilling to recognize that you don't take someone in a higher weight body and prescribe eating disorder behaviors to treat an eating disorder.
Exactly. And you were so right about who is funding all this. I mean, it's just like with so much stuff, the diet industry and the whole advertisement industry and the pharmaceutical industry as well. You know, we're being fed such crap if we don't check what the research is actually, where it's coming from, what the science actually says. Because who's checking for that? We all just want clickbait information, and it seems like a quick fix solution to just operate on someone and then you're fine. And you only have to check for forums on the internet discussing side effects and, you know, the harms that can result from having such operations, and then whoa, there's another story. You know, it's not just a neat thing. And I know how much my friend suffered. I mean, it was horrible to watch her.
Yeah.
And she said as well, from all the pain, she said for like a half a year, she said she wouldn't do it again. But then now she's in a phase where she probably just loves to buy smaller clothes every other week. And I see that she's running toward a cliff with that.
Exactly.
And she gets no support whatsoever. She was just giving them money or her insurance, but it was easy made money for that surgeon, and she doesn't get any support now. She's on her own, and nobody's treating that eating disorder demon that is somehow living inside her.
Exactly. It's always going to be there for her. It's usually about an 18-month honeymoon period, and then the slow creep of weight gain begins, and it's just going to trigger even more of what was already there for her and the others who experienced this. And, you know, it's interesting. We've been working here in the United States. BETA has been working with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and we've been teaching them about eating disorders and trying to put in place different regulatory tools to limit access to bariatric devices for people with eating disorders, and also to provide training for bariatric professionals about eating disorders. And it's just so amazing to me that these physicians and others get absolutely no training in school about eating disorders and have no clue about just how dangerous, utterly dangerous they are and how many people have them. Mm-hmm. So, you know, unfortunately, sometimes in order to make changes, you have to do it through a policy direction, because educating the masses just isn't enough.
Something you said before, I think, needs to be investigated a little bit, and I don't think I have enough knowledge about that. You said most people think that anorexia is basically the other side of binge eating disorder, or vice versa, that it's basically the same thing, either an aversion to food or an addiction to food in
Right.
the most simplistic terms. And please tell everyone how that is not true.
Well, and the other way that it's framed in terms of it being the flip side is anorexia is extreme low weight and binge eating disorder is high weight. When in terms of both anorexia and binge eating disorder, someone can be in the range from very low weight to very high weight for both of those disorders. So in that way, it is not the flip side of the coin. But in terms of in anorexia, the primary tool is restriction. Some people with anorexia binge, some don't. In binge eating disorder, the primary tool is binge eating, but I've never met somebody with binge eating disorder that doesn't restrict severely and who doesn't engage in all kinds of other eating disorder behaviors. So they're much more alike than they are different. And what that means to me is that we can't treat them completely different. You know, we're not going. For some people with anorexia, yes, they do need to, from my limited understanding, and I'm not a professional, so take this with a grain of salt, but my understanding is that some people will need help in gaining weight in anorexia. But, you know, people with binge eating disorder who are in higher weight bodies, weight loss is not the answer.
It's so ironic. I mean, I never understood anything about this. And had you said this to me before, like 2 years ago, I would have said, what? But now I see that both in totally different bodies and to different extents, but both are somehow malnourished.
Yes.
Because what I didn't realize and what is so terrible about those who suffer from binge eating disorder is that they are so misunderstood. They are being categorized as just gluttons. And
Yes.
no one ever puts two and two together and identifies them as people who have always constantly been on diets and then binge ate out of that deprivation, then felt so terribly shameful, they restricted, then they binged again, and they weight cycled themselves up. But they are being so misunderstood, and they are just being put in the box of the glutton who eats all day and is lazy. And I think that adds to the whole disease. It makes it even more severe, and it exacerbates the disease when you're constantly being misunderstood. Just as anorexia, people tell anorexic people, just eat, for Christ's sakes.
Right.
When that's exactly what you cannot do. It's not a vanity thing.
Exactly.
Just as with binge eating, no one would choose that.
Right.
As, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. It's insane, but that's what we're implying when we're saying fat people are lazy, fat people are gluttons. This is so painful how we're stigmatizing eating disorders in people, especially in bigger bodies. And so I'm really glad that you do talk about it and make this more understandable for people.
An example of this that is so interesting to me is that the person who oversaw the DSM committee for the American Psychiatric Association years ago made a comment to the New York Times newspaper when binge eating disorder was being considered for inclusion in the DSM-5. And his comment was, I can't remember the exact words, but what he said was basically that we are including glorified gluttony into the DSM as a psychiatric disorder.
Jesus Christ.
And when I read that, when I saw that this was 2 or 3 years into Beta being in existence, and the exact reason that I started the organization, but it was just so incredible to me that this person who was considered or is considered an authority figure in the world of psychiatric conditions was saying this group of 12 million or so people really do not deserve diagnosis. They just need to stop eating.
Jesus.
Yeah.
I have so many thoughts, because it probably takes a sufferer to really develop some understanding and compassion, because when you see how it feels, when you know how it feels, then you are automatically more open to other people talking about that. And the other people, they just dismiss everything. And for the longest time, I didn't seek treatment because I was ashamed. I thought I was just broken and my body was broken, and I needed to go to such extreme measures to control my body. And I did that in different ways. But I always thought, well, I'm not anorexic, I'm not thin enough, and I'm binging, so I can't be anorexic. And then I'm not a bulimic because I'm not vomiting, I'm not taking laxatives, I'm just sporty. What the hell?
Right.
So, and I can't have binge eating disorder even though I'm binging. So what the hell do I have? And
Right.
I think every eating disorder in itself is something that morphs and something that has all these components. That's what every anorexic says. Deep, deep down, all they want to do is eat and never stop eating. For Christ's sakes, they're so deprived. That's why they're so afraid of letting go of the reins, right? And we're all confused and being overly categorized, and I don't see how that would contribute. So before we go into the whole story of Beta, I want to know, how did you get out of that shame? I mean, we left off at you having had the operation, and then knowing and realizing immediately that it was the wrong decision.
I came out on the other side, and I just knew that I had enough recovery prior to the operation that I recognized that this was A, not going to be the answer, and B, that I really was this was a sign of my eating disorder. And that I knew that all along, but I just kept pushing that down because...
What do you mean by that? It was a sign?
Opting to have the surgery, the weight loss surgery, was actually a sign of my eating disorder. That it was the eating disorder. It was that
you needed
voice.
To be controlled, and if you can't do it yourself, then you have to let a surgeon do it.
Right. And that's what, eating disorder, so much of an eating disorder is the external, dictating to the internal. And I just knew that I needed to assemble a team and get myself back into therapy and, whatever I needed to do. Mm-hmm. Because I had the lap band, that was the device I chose. Part of the restriction is that there's a little tube leading to a port that is filled with saline, and that's how the band around your stomach is. It comes together. It's tighter and tighter around your stomach and restricts the food intake. So I opted not to have the band filled. I kept it open, and I still had a lot of restriction just by having the band in place, but I didn't fill it to the extent that it could be filled. And for that reason, I lost some weight, but I didn't lose a great amount of weight. And I'm so grateful that that's what I chose to do, because I think that if I had lost a great amount of weight, it just would have prolonged the time that I needed to get to a point where I was willing to address the eating disorder again. So I did get back into treatment, and I had a wonderful team who told me that dieting is not going to be the answer to recovery, that I probably will live in my higher weight body for the rest of my life. We don't know where my body is going to go with treatment, and, worked on addressing my internalized weight stigma alongside the eating disorder.
Your own internalized, that you believing that you were a lesser being because you were in a bigger body?
Yes, all of those messages that we get out in the world, the biases around weight, and that in itself is a trauma. So it really required a trauma-informed therapeutic approach for me to recover, because weight stigma in itself really and truly is a trauma. So that is critical for, I believe, everybody with an eating disorder to identify and address their internalized weight stigmas.
It's the key, I believe.
It's the key, yeah. And that was the time that I decided, once I had been in treatment for a while, I decided I need to start an organization, because I'm not getting this information from the eating disorders community as a whole. I never see myself at eating disorder events or conferences or represented in the national organizations. The higher weight individual with eating disorders are not represented at all within the eating disorders community. And that's really why I started BETA. And that was in 2008. And the first couple years, we just worked on trying to support the momentum toward having BED in the DSM-5. And that happened in 2012. It was published in 2013. Our feeling was that was a great and critical success. And now there's a whole lot of work to do to pull that through and to make sure that we are being represented properly. And so that is sort of what drives me on a daily basis.
Congratulations. I mean, there's a woman who takes action. I mean, how did you form an organization?
I was fortunate that two things. One is I had worked in the nonprofit sector. I worked in the cancer field and did advocacy and some policy work and fundraising and all of that in the cancer field. And I also had worked in the pharmaceutical industry, where the pharmaceutical industry has its dark pieces, but it also has some very positive pieces. And I learned a lot there. And I took some of the funding that I made as an employee of a very large company that gave stock and that sort of thing, and was able to use that to start BETA. So it just was sort of the perfect storm of tools to be able to do this and to start an organization. So it was something that I had thought about quite a bit, and it just seemed to be the time. It was the right time to do it. I feel very fortunate in that, and definitely has not just been me. It's been so many people who have contributed and helped build this organization. And we continue to learn. It's
don't we
every
all?
Day. Yeah. Every day is a learning process in of itself.
Yes, you're so right about that. First of all, I didn't know there was BETA. I didn't know about any of the eating disorder associations or organizations, because here in Switzerland, there's simply nothing like that. I do feel slightly extremely underrepresented, and I still feel like an oddball, because there's no group, there's no like-minded individuals, nowhere that this is being openly talked about. That's why this podcast is in English, because it would have fallen on totally dry ground with this community. And this is so sad, actually. But what I certainly didn't know was the fact that there were conferences for eating disorders. And just as I said, this is not something that is happening here in Switzerland. And so last year through all of these wonderful connections that I was able to make after I started my Facebook community and this podcast, I started to hear some of my dietitian and therapist guests talk about going to the Binge Eating Disorder conference. And I was like, what? And I believe it was in LA last year.
It was in San Francisco.
Oh, San Francisco. I wasn't sure of one of them. And that they had such a great time meeting each other, and they were posting pictures, these people hugging each other for the first time, because the internet really has brought wonderful people together that realized, hey, we're not alone with this, and there's other ways of approaching these topics. And I kind of remember feeling sad not being able to be there with all of you. So fill me in. I'm so curious, what is happening at a conference like this?
Yeah. Well, BETA has, I guess this year will be our 7th or 8th national conference. I can't remember. But for the first time, we're actually partnering with the National Eating Disorders Association and holding a joint conference. So the entire spectrum of eating disorders will be represented. There still will be a strong focus on binge eating disorder, but it's the first time that our two national organizations are actually collaborating.
How amazing is that?
Yeah,
that's when everybody gets to understand each other better and realizing how close all eating disorders really are at the basis.
Right. So I'm very excited about that.
Wow.
And what happens is community happens. I mean, there is a lot of education, and, clinicians are there to learn how to treat their clients better. And all the time we're learning new tools and so forth. But we're talking about groups that are not in the room and who else we need to include. BETA has spent quite a bit of time, and myself personally, thinking about marginalized communities who are not represented at our conferences usually. And so we're very focused on intersectionality and how we make sure that everyone has a voice at the table. But I think that the real magic is in the connection. And we really focus on how do we build this community? What are the pieces that are missing? Who's not a part of it right now? Who needs to be a part of it? And how do we support each other at the end of the day?
And did you choose all the lecturers when you organized this for the first time? Did you just know whom to ask? Wow.
I did put a board of directors together, and so I had them helping, and they were the first board of directors were all clinicians, and so they really helped me understand who was doing what in the community. But at that time, binge eating disorder was not even in the DSM-5, so it all was sort of underground. There were all these people talking about health at every size and the fat acceptance movement and weight stigma and non-dieting and all these things that have come together in this wonderful way to show the rest of the eating disorders community that there's this whole other group of people who may have a different way of approaching some of these problems. So they were critical in helping that first time. And we had a wonderful, it really was such a great feeling to see all these people on stage who, for some of them, didn't usually have a platform, so that was exciting.
Yes, and so many people probably came up to you and said, this was the first time that I felt represented and not alone. And
absolutely.
Actually being allowed to drop some of the shame.
Yeah. Yeah. And we hear that every year. And to me, that's what it's all about. So it's critical and it's warming, and it helps me in, my ability to keep going and in my own recovery. Mm-hmm. So I always say it really was, it was a gift to me
Exactly. It's like the podcast was a gift to me, as in I'm trying to help myself and realizing that when we're really helping ourselves, we're automatically helping others. And it's not a selfish endeavor, because as we're learning and we're becoming more vulnerable, then why not let other people see it? And maybe that helps them feeling less alone. And that gives me so much in return also. So I think... And I guess you would never have thought how big this would be one day and how many people would come there and how fast this would grow.
Yeah. I mean, I knew there were so many people underrepresented. And it's still, I mean, I'm not going to say that we've had everybody just flock to Beta right away, because there are so many people out there, the majority, in fact, with binge eating disorder, who are still suffering, who have no clue that they have an eating disorder.
Yeah, still trying to diet it away.
Right. They're sitting in weight management clinics and in psychologists' offices who are helping them with weight loss, and in bariatric surgery centers, and at home, behind closed doors. And they have no idea. And those are the people that we have to reach.
Exactly. Oh, I feel you so much, really. And well, I mean, we don't know what we don't know, but we all have our different paths to recover from whatever we're recovering from. And now that if you could give your younger self any advice, what would you tell her, and at what age?
Let's see. Good question. I think I would just tell her it's all going to be okay.
At what age?
Probably, well, I think I just would need to tell her definitely at 5. But, in age-appropriate ways every year from there forward. And, I think that the biggest thing, too, besides just telling her it's okay, is that the body she's in right now is perfect, and it can do anything it wants. There's no limitations because it feels heavy, because it is bigger than the other kids. That it's not a problem. You can do whatever you feel comfortable doing, and try it, see if you like it, and keep going.
I think we could all need some of that, going back to our very, very young self and just hug ourselves and say, don't buy into all of that bullshit. You're perfect the way you are.
Right.
I think I would go and hug myself in my own crib, for Christ's sakes, and just,
absolutely,
you're going to be okay. It's going to be fine. And you're going to be a survivor. Basically, we're all survivors. Fucking hell. We wouldn't be here, and that makes us heroes, right? I mean, we all made it until this very moment, and that's quite something given the circumstances.
It really is. It really is. I agree.
So before I ask you my final question, let everybody know where they can find you, Chevese.
Sure. Beta's webpage is betaonline.com. And our toll-free number is 855-855-2332.
You don't have a personal website, right?
No, I actually will have one in the upcoming year. I'm writing a book with a clinician, but I haven't started putting it together yet. But I'll send it to you when I do have it.
Okay. So my final question to you is, what would you like to be remembered for?
Oh, boy. That's a good question. I think there's sort of different layers to that, obviously. But the first thing that comes to mind is just being a kind person who wants to help. But I think the second thing that I'm so proud of is that, starting an organization that really has made significant change in the lives of people who are living in higher weight bodies and have eating disorders. I think that's the big thing, because I I see that change already and what it means to people, and I'm extremely proud of that.
You should be. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an awesome conversation.
Thank you too. It really has been lovely to meet you, and I hope you will be able to come to Beta some year.
I'll try my best.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
This was today's dose of badassery from Life Unrestricted. Find the show notes with links to everything we mentioned in this episode over at lifeunrestricted.org. And if this show is making you feel good, awesome, make sure to subscribe and please let others feel good too. By leaving a 5-star review on iTunes, you'll help make this show more visible and therefore more accessible for others. You're the best. Thanks.